Hashtag Lee Kuan Yew's Malaysian betrayal that built world's richest nation. True story. 580 square kilometers. $516 GDP per capita. Zero natural resources. That's all Singapore had when they were brutally expelled from Malaysia on August 9, 1965. International experts estimated 6 months before total economic collapse. Few expected Singapore to survive when it became an independent country. But what happened in the next 24 years created the most impossible economic miracle in human history. I've spent 15 years studying impossible national transformations. I've analyzed over 200 economic miracles, but what Singapore achieved breaks every law of economics, geography, and political science. Singapore's per capita GDP jumped by a staggering 2,700% from $516 in 1965 to $14,500 by 1991, and it's now over $65,000. In the next 10 minutes, you'll discover the psychological warfare strategy Lee Kuan Yew used to turn betrayal into the ultimate revenge. How, according to later revelations, intelligence efforts targeted Singapore's early independence period, yet Lee still built the world's safest nation. The transformation that began with 12.7% annual GDP growth for 8 consecutive years within a remarkable 24-year journey. The wounded yet winning principles that transformed global economics forever. But first, the shocking truth about how close Singapore came to being invaded and destroyed. To understand Singapore's catastrophic fall, you need to know it was Britain's crown jewel for 146 years. Singapore controlled 25% of global trade as the gateway to the East. The British had built the ultimate strategic prize, world's largest naval base outside Britain. Southeast Asia's undisputed financial center, the most multicultural trading port in history. While Singapore had recovered from World War II devastation, nearly 70% of the population lived in slums. But it was still the Hong Kong of the 1960s, prosperous, protected, and permanent. But Singapore had a fatal weakness that no one saw coming. Lee Kuan Yew passionately believed in multiracialism and a merger with Malaysia. He thought joining Malaysia in 1963 would secure Singapore's future forever. The economic rationale was clear. A combined market of 12 million people would overcome Singapore's small market limitations. Lee had no idea he was walking into the greatest political betrayal in modern Asian history. On August 7, 1965, everything Singapore believed about security, partnership, and survival would be shattered in a single announcement. August 7, 1965, Malaysian Parliament voted 126-0 to expel Singapore from the Federation, with all Singaporean MPs boycotting the vote. The numbers reveal the impossible situation: 70% of households in overcrowded conditions, a third living in slums, 14% unemployment rate, with half the population illiterate, no natural resources, no hinterland, no industry, dependent on outside world for food, energy, and even water, surrounded by larger neighbors within 1,000 miles who could easily overrun the island. Lee Kuan Yew broke down, crying on live television, calling it a moment of anguish that literally broke everything we stood for. The strategic nightmare was beyond anything in modern history. Indonesia's confrontacy was ongoing, bombing attempts in Singapore, including the tragic McDonald House bombing that killed 3 and injured 33. Trade with Indonesia shrank. Imports declined 23%, exports declined 31%. British forces withdrawing by 1971, leaving Singapore defenseless. Labor strikes from 1963 to 1968, making Singapore unattractive to investors. Racial tensions threatening civil war between Chinese and Malays. The running joke: a factory would be set up Monday. Exploitation of workers' banners by Friday. August 9, 1965, Singapore's first day as a supposedly independent nation. Lee Kuan Yew had said in 1957 that independent Singapore was a political, economic, and geographical absurdity. Now, he was living that nightmare. Every expert predicted immediate collapse. International financial assistance was limited. The UN said the situation was hopeless. Even Lee believed Singapore faced tremendous odds with an improbable chance of survival. This is the moment where 99% of nations would have begged to be readmitted to Malaysia. This is where most countries accept vassal status to survive. What happened next proves the difference between ordinary nations and legends. During those first desperate months, Lee Kuan Yew discovered the ultimate, wounded yet winning principle. Singapore's betrayal wasn't a death sentence. It was liberation from dependency. Every wound tells a story of survival. Every scar speaks of resilience. Lee realized Malaysia's rejection freed Singapore from the politics of race-based policies and economic constraints. No resources? Singapore would become the most efficient nation on earth. No, a military? They would build the smartest defense per square kilometer. No hinterland? They would become the world's hinterland. Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong later revealed the secret of Singapore's success when asked by Nepal's PM. I smiled and replied, Lee Kuan Yew. Lee developed what I call the Singapore inversion strategy, turning every weakness into a competitive advantage. Phase 1. Reframe size as speed. While newly independent nations adopted protectionist policies, Singapore had to go against the grain and open borders to foreign investors. Small size meant instant implementation, while larger nations took years. Phase 2. Weaponized geographic vulnerability. Singapore consulted experts from West Germany and Israel, allocating 19% of budget to defense, among the highest per capita military expenditure globally. Vulnerability became ultra-preparedness. Phase 3. Transcend racial divisions. Lee implemented meritocracy in civil service, politics, business, and schools. Division became unity through competence. From 1965 to 1973, Singapore achieved 12.7% annual GDP growth. Here's how they did the impossible. 1965 to 1966, survival infrastructure. Established Singapore Armed Forces with Israeli training model. Joined UN on September 21, 1965, Commonwealth in October. Built water independence to reduce Malaysian dependence. 1966 to 1967, economic revolution. The Economic Development Board, established in 1961, expanded its role to attract foreign investment. Courted global companies targeting worldwide markets, not just domestic. Manufacturing share began climbing from 14% in 1965, ultimately reaching 22% by 1975. 1967 to 1968, social engineering masterpiece. Introduced national service in 1967, rapidly expanding defense force. Implemented effective control of corruption through competitive compensation. Created English language education system for global competitiveness. Nobody understood what Singapore was becoming. Malaysia thought Singapore was slowly dying. They had no idea a global superpower was being forged through pure willpower. 1968 to 1970, Singapore unleashed economic warfare on the world's assumptions about what small nations could achieve. The results shattered every prediction. GDP growth averaging 8% from 1960 to 1999, with 9.5% average since independence. In later decades, foreign companies dominated manufacturing output and exports. Singapore became world's leading producer of hard disk drives by the 1980s. Infrastructure ranked best globally with 95.4 out of 100 score. Malaysia and Indonesia watched in disbelief as their hopeless neighbor became the region's economic engine. Success created an unstoppable cascade effect. 1960s, co-founded ASEAN in 1967. 1970s, established substantial industrial base in higher value-added electronics, petrochemicals, precision engineering. Joined non-aligned movement in 1970. 1980s, became Asia's undisputed financial hub. 1990s, joined World Trade Organization and achieved rapid modernization. 2000s, achieved first world status in one generation. As Lee observed, we have created this out of nothingness, from its humble beginnings as a fishing village of 150 souls in 1819 to the biggest metropolis 2 degrees north of the equator. Today, Singapore stands as the ultimate proof that wounds can become weapons. GDP per capita increased from $516 in 1965 to over $65,000 today, higher than the US. Population grew from a small island nation to 5+ million in a thriving metropolis. Zero natural resources to infinite human potential maximization. From 70% slum conditions to 0% extreme poverty. Richard Nixon described Lee as a big man on a small stage who in other times and places might have attained world stature of Churchill, Disraeli, or Gladstone. Singapore proved the ultimate truth. Your greatest betrayal can become your greatest liberation. Singapore's impossible journey reveals 3 universal wounded yet winning principles. Principle 1. Invert your constraints into advantages. Singapore had no domestic market, so they targeted the entire global market. Your limitations force creative solutions that competitors with resources never discover. Principle 2. Use rejection as independence acceleration. Malaysia's expulsion freed Singapore from racial politics and economic restrictions. Sometimes what feels like abandonment is actually liberation disguised as crisis. Principle 3. Build systems that transcend personalities. Singapore's success came from meritocracy, anti-corruption systems, and education investment. Create processes that turn individual wounds into institutional wisdom. Singapore's miracle proves the fundamental wounded yet winning philosophy. Every wound tells a story of survival. Every scar speaks of resilience. Every betrayal is set up for independence. Singapore didn't succeed despite their abandonment. They succeeded because of it. Malaysia's rejection became Singapore's rocket fuel. Their isolation became their innovation laboratory. Whatever rejection you're facing, whatever limitations seem impossible, remember Singapore's 24-year transformation. Your constraints aren't evidence of weakness. They're opportunities for solutions no one else will discover. If Singapore's transformation inspired you, comment below. What limitation are you ready to invert into an advantage? And for more wounded yet winning stories of impossible national comebacks, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Remember, you're not limited by your resources. You're liberated by your resourcefulness. Every constraint is just a catalyst waiting for activation.